Hello again. What we're doing here is considering what makes a policy good or bad. Inherently subjective question. However, we're going to try and think through some tools that we can use in order to understand that. So as always, we have our key terms and our key concepts here, and these are going to guide us in our discussion of when is a policy good, when is a policy bad, what words can we use to describe those things. So to get started, let's think about one way that's probably the most common sense way to judge a policy, and that's, well, how effective is that policy, right? In other words, does the policy actually lead to the outcomes that we had hoped it would? If it's a policy meant to alleviate poverty, does poverty go down? Is it a policy to change immigration or public defense? Do those things change in the ways that we'd hoped? That is one really key litmus test that we would look for a policy to do. We would call a policy successful or good when it is effective at achieving its goals. We would call it somewhat a failure when it is not effective. Of course, this gets kind of complicated very quickly. The specific ways that a policy is designed and the specific ways that a policy is implemented will have profound effects upon its effectiveness. And of course, there are even more difficulties. First, there's a great amount of complexity with a lot of these issues that we're working on. You know, the social world is full of really, really complicated issues, and it's not for lack of trying that we have a lot of social problems. It's because they are intrinsically complicated things that even experts have really different opinions about how to go about solving, about what effectiveness would look like in the first place. Another problem is sometimes the public has very low understanding of these complex issues and, in fact, can oppose things that might be really beneficial in the long run. In your text, Shively goes over how central banks are typically shielded from popular pressure. That is the idea that the big central bank here, that's the Federal Reserve, and you'll hear lots about the Federal Reserve and interest rates, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the idea of shielding banks from the people is that this will allow the bank to pursue policies that may be unpopular in the short run, but in the long run will be more beneficial for the country as a whole and its economic prosperity. Finally, we have to figure out what we want our policy to be effective at. It's a very subjective thing. I might have different goals than you would, and what we would see as important in a policy might be very different. So effectiveness is an interesting and important way to start thinking about how desirable or undesirable a policy is. And I think that when we go and consider individual policies, we definitely need to put questions of effectiveness front and center. But because of these difficulties, often effectiveness alone is not necessarily going to get us far enough to understand a policy. Well, if not for effectiveness, how about justice? Well, surely we want policies to be just, but back up again. What does this mean? Does this mean that we're being fair? Does this mean that we're treating everybody as they deserve? Perhaps it means that we are running a very utilitarian society, and utilitarianism is the basic idea that we will do something when it will have the best effect on the greatest number of people possible. However, a lot of people say, well, even if most people benefit from something, what if some people are really screwed over? What if some people are really hurt? What if some vulnerable minority really has to pay a huge price for the majority to do well? Others talk about the importance of moral absolutes. There are some things that should never happen. People should never kill or steal, no matter what. Of course, the idea of moral absolutes and utilitarianism can often come into conflict with one another. But we do have some moral absolutes built into our system, right? The idea of protection of basic unalienable rights, that the government can never take away your right to speech, assembly, etc., etc. And the bottom line here is when it comes to justice, there are many, many ways to look at this, but often these ways are in conflict with one another. So again, with both effectiveness and justice, we are seeing that things are pretty complicated, and a lot is going to depend on your own subjective assessment of what is desirable in the first place, what is normatively desirable, and then of course of how things go together in society, what causes what, or the empirical support. One way to think about a beneficial aspect of policy is when there is due process. And what due process means is that every single person in the state is treated the same by the law. and that the law is always applied by a standard set of procedures. This is very much the idea that justice is blind. Whether it is you or me or a senator or a rich business person up for trial, if we are accused of the same crime, we should receive the same treatment in the eyes of the law. The procedures should be the same. We should all receive due process. And again, that is one of those unalienable rights that is written right into the Bill of Rights. This is actually opposed to substantive justice, and the idea of arbitrary rule, which you can certainly see in greater detail in your text. Right? But the idea is that this is the opposite of what would be arbitrary or random, or even preferential treatment for sort of preferred people. So the idea that I go up for trial and a senator goes up for trial, if there's arbitrary treatment, well, the senator's probably going to get better treatment than me. But if there's due process, we'll both get the exact same treatment. Now, being treated equally in the eyes of the law is a great way to increase legitimacy. And remember, we talked about the importance of legitimacy in the state functioning and establishing sovereignty in the first place. Okay, so due process is one way to go forward. Another key way to go forward is by considering incentives. We've talked about this a lot, but it's always going to be really important to consider the incentives that a policy creates in determining whether this policy is desirable and whether it's going to be effective. One way to do this, and a common way that economists and political scientists will try and hash out how something will play out, how a policy would play out in the real world, is by considering how a rational actor would react. Now, the rational actor is an oversimplification. It's a model. And this is the person that is always going to pursue his or her self-interest. And usually they mean self-interest in terms of monetary, in terms of which will provide me the most money. So remember when we talked about the perverse incentives of trying to fix traffic or trying to get rid of India's Cobra problem? Well, the problem with these is that when we build more lanes for people to use, it actually creates an incentive. It's cheaper for people and it's quicker for people to just drive still, and that increases the overall level of traffic. This is a rational actor being moved by different incentive structures made by a policy. So the policy here is that there's going to be more roads and more lanes, and it changes my incentive as a rational actor to drive. It doesn't actually alleviate the problem of traffic congestion. It in fact probably increases that problem. Well, this is why we will want to consider something called incentive compatibility when we judge policies and when we design policies. Incentive compatibility is essentially the idea that a rational actor acting in his or her own self-interest will do the thing that is sort of desirable for everybody. So it is sort of overcoming, it's a way of overcoming a collective action problem. We want people acting in their own self-interests to have the socially desirable behavior. And so when it comes to traffic planning, we would think, well, the socially desirable behavior is not driving because we want fewer cars on the road to decrease congestion and decrease pollution. Well, how can we do that? How can we change the incentives? It turns out that, as we've discussed before, adding tolls, making it more costly to drive, is probably the best way and most efficacious way to get people to choose other forms of transportation over just driving all by themselves in their own car. Well, that is incentive compatibility. We are changing the incentives of driving so that it is in an individual actor's own self-interest to not drive. Not driving being the thing that we want, being the socially desirable outcome. Incentive compatibility is lining up those individual incentives with the socially desirable outcome. A final way that we will think about the judging policies is the veil of ignorance. And this can be a really useful way to think through the desirability and level of justice of a policy. This is a thought experiment by Rawls, and Rawls is an American political theorist, and this is a thought experiment because it's not something we can really do in the real world. It is actually impossible, but by thinking through it, we can come to conclusions about what is going to be more or less fair, more or less just. So, like I said, this is a thought experiment to get to a just society. And essentially, the long and short of it is that you make rules without knowing your own identity. and how the rules would affect you. And so, of course, we all have very strong identities that we bring to everything. We are Americans, we are men or we are women, we are rich or we are poor, we are white or black, or all sorts of different identities, down to the sorts of things that you like to do in your free time, the sorts of things that are your passions. Well, the idea of trying to design a policy from behind the veil of ignorance is that you are ignorant of what aspects you have, what you bring to this. So when you are going to go out and design a healthcare policy, which you are going to do for your midterm essay, one really useful way to do this would be to say, okay, I'm going to imagine that I am not the person that I am not the super healthy person or the person living with this medical condition or the person of this age or of this gender or anything like that. And then you try to design the policy without that knowledge. And the idea here is that you are going to get to policies that are going to be more fair for everybody in society, that you're not going to be favoring yourself and the attributes that you just happen to have. You will instead be favoring the most people possible and coming up with the most fair outcomes. So in the discussion, I'm going to ask you to think about the veil of ignorance and an issue that you think would be the most different if we had designed this policy from behind the veil of ignorance and it wasn't the way that it was today. So start thinking about that. I'm really looking forward to hearing from you. And of course, if anything about this is unclear, please do get in touch on the module Q&A board so we can make sure to get rid of any confusion that you have before you go in and take that module 4 quiz. Thanks again for joining me. Have a wonderful day.